Hi guys, today we are going to talk about a photography lesson. We're starting our little photography unit and we're going to start specifically talking about some camera settings and especially shutter speed. So let's get started. Okay, so here is our exposure triangle. This is something that you see in photography. It's just showing us basically that none of the settings that you apply to your camera are working sort of without adjusting or without affecting any of the other settings. So if I increase my ISO, I get brighter photos, but they also get grainier, okay? We'll talk about ISO more later. Today we're going to focus a little bit more on shutter speed. We'll touch on aperture as well, but I just want you to be aware of everything. ISO, if you essentially want it to be as low as you can get it. So if you can keep your ISO at 100, you'll get the most clear pictures. They might be a little bit darker, but they will be more clear. As you increase your ISO, then they get grainier. And your camera only goes up, I think, to 6400. The T5s do, the Rebel T5s do. I know the T6s might be a little bit higher than that, but I'm not positive at this very moment. But anyway, you usually want to stay away from those higher numbers because you do get some grain, and that's what these little images are depicting. But just so you know. So shutter speed, if you have a faster shutter speed, you're sort of capturing the action rather than capturing the sort of blur of the action. So if my shutter speed is lower, then I'm going to blur that action, but it's going to be brighter. If my shutter speed is faster, I will be able to capture a smaller snippet of time, but my photo would probably be a little bit darker because we're on the darker end here, okay? And then it gets brighter. Aperture has to do with the depth of field. So if I am photographing a landscape where I have a mountain range and I want to really have a nice, huge depth of field, I would have my camera set at a bigger f number, maybe even bigger than this f16. If I were doing any sort of portraiture, I would probably want a smaller f number somewhere in this area, depending on the number of people that I would be including in my portrait. So the smaller f number equals a brighter photo as well. Like I said, I just want you to be aware of how this all works. You don't need to memorize this or fully understand it at this point, but I want you to be aware that that those settings play together. Okay, so now we are going to take some photos to practice. I'm going to walk you through the steps that you're going to go through at the end of this presentation, and you can change your camera settings as we go, but then I'll go through the process of exactly what you need to do after we get everything all set. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to set your camera to M on the mode dial. So on top of your camera, you should see this dial right here, which is the mode dial. You want yours set to M, like mine is set to right here. The reason, or the way I know that it's set to M, is it lines up with this white line right here. Okay, so that's M. If I were to turn it around and switch it to any of the other modes, that would affect the settings differently. But we want to control all of the settings, and that's why we're setting ours to manual. That's what the M means, manual. Okay, you want to set your lens to autofocus. That's the AF. We don't want it set at MF right now. That takes a little bit more practice. We'll let the lens focus for us. So we're going to set it to AF. And we want the stabilizer set to on, and that helps reduce the camera shake just a little bit. Okay, and now we are going to adjust our settings. We want our shutter speed set to 1/250th of a second. So that's what that means, 1/250th of a second. If you think about how quick a second actually is, and now you're taking 250th of that second, it's a really, really short amount of time, just so you're aware. If I were photographing any sporting event, I would have to have my camera or my shutter speed set to somewhere around here. If I were outside, I'd maybe try to bump that up even a little bit more, just in order to capture motion. And that's what the higher shutter speed does, is it captures motion. So that's that setting right there. To adjust that shutter speed, you turn the main dial, which is on the top of your camera, in close proximity to the shutter button. Okay, so when you're actually snapping a picture, you're pushing down that shutter button. That is right over here. This dial is kind of right behind that shutter button. Okay, and we know what setting we are adjusting because of the little orange arrows. So here you can see these little orange arrows. So that tells me that when I change that dial, that is adjusting this setting right here. If I were to see those orange arrows over here, I would know that I'm adjusting that setting right there. Same thing anywhere else. I think these two are where it's constrained to. So we'll cover that. Okay, so now that we have the shutter speed set to 1/250th of a second, we need to adjust the aperture, and we want that for this activity set at f6.3. Okay, so how do we adjust that? We need to get those little orange arrows over there, right? So right now you can see that my little orange arrows are still by my shutter speed. We need to get them over here. And to do that, we push and hold this button right here. So we're on the back of your camera, this button right here, sort of to the top right of your display screen. Press and hold that. And now those little orange arrows will move over there and we can adjust our aperture. Okay, so now we need to adjust one more setting, which is the ISO, and we see that number right here. Mine's set to 100 right here. To do that, you hit that ISO button right there, and that should take you to a screen that looks like this one right here. So once you get to that screen, then you're going to adjust, you're going to turn this dial again. So the one that's right under my finger again, and that should allow you to adjust the ISO. Okay, we want ours set at 100. Once you get your little green box, your display screen might be a little bit differently colored too. You can change those settings just so you're aware. But just so the ISO number that we want highlighted is 100. Once we get to that, as you can see here, it says to hit OK to set that. So we're going to hit this set button, and that kind of tells the camera, okay, yes, that is the setting we want. Okay, so now we're ready to take some photos. You're going to use the settings that we just set to take our photos. So the first one will be 1/250th of a second for our shutter speed. Our aperture will be f6.3 and our ISO will be 100. Okay, it will probably turn out something like this one right here. So nice and dark, right? Not a very good photo. I wouldn't put this in an art show. So that's not going to work. So we need to make some adjustments. And for this activity, all we're going to change is the shutter speed and nothing else. So we're going to slow down the shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. So it's a little bit faster than our previous. It's actually double as fast as our previous, or sorry, double as slow as our previous setting. So that one might turn out something like this. So we're getting a little bit more light in there. You can kind of see my coffee mug, but not super well yet, but a little bit better, right? And just a reminder, your settings were exactly this. So this number stayed the same. So your aperture was still f6.3, your ISO was 100, the shutter speed is what we changed. So we're down to 1/125th of a second. So a little bit faster, or sorry, a little bit slower. Geez, I keep getting that reversed. Anyway, so that's still not enough light. So we need to adjust the speed again. We are going to change the shutter speed and nothing else. Just to remind you, we're going to slow that down to 1/80th of a second. So that one might turn out something like this. So it's getting a little bit brighter, still not great, but we're getting there, right? So we're slowing down the shutter speed so that we're allowing more lens to enter, or more light to enter the lens, and we're getting a little bit brighter of a photo. And again, those are our settings. Just to remind you, again, aperture stayed the same, ISO stayed the same. Shutter speed is what we changed. Okay, so we are almost there. Again, we're going to change the shutter speed, and that is it, nothing else. Okay, so we're going to slow that down to 1/30th of a second. And now we are making some progress, right? So there we go. We have a decently well lit photo. It's still a tiny little bit dark, but overall it's pretty good. So the shutter speed on that one was 1/30th of a second, aperture f6.3, ISO 100. So again, these bottom two settings stayed the same. Shutter speed is the only thing that we changed. Okay, so when we were doing that little activity, we started out with a photo that was too dark and we needed to brighten it. So we decreased the shutter speed. We made it go slower. So what if we started out in the opposite direction where our photo was too bright? Well, so that's exactly what I just said. Sorry. We could just do the opposite of what we did. So instead of decreasing the shutter speed to allow more light to enter the lens, we could increase the shutter speed to allow less light to enter the lens. Okay, so now it's your turn. You're going to set up a still life of some kind. It can be nice and simple like my mug. Don't go too crazy with this. Probably the simpler the better. You do want some sort of shape that has, or some object that has some form to it. So nothing flat. You don't want a piece of paper or anything like that. And I would try to keep your background nice and simple, as well as the object nice and simple. You're going to take 4 photos. You're going to set your camera up the way I had mine at the beginning. So the shutter speed should be 1/250th of a second, aperture f6.3, and ISO 100 to start with. Okay, and then you're going to create either a Google Doc or a Google Slide presentation with your 4 photos and the settings that each one was captured using. So your slides should look something like this. If you're using a Google Doc, then it would look obviously a little bit different. But if I were putting mine together in a Google Slide presentation, it would look something like this. So there's my photo. We have my photo here, and then all the settings right over here to the side. So there's my first slide, second slide, again, my photo at the different settings. So I slowed down the shutter speed. You are going to take 4 photos again, one at 1/250th of a second, one at 1/125th of a second, one at 1/80th of a second, and one at 1/30th of a second. The aperture again and the ISO are staying exactly the same, just the shutter speed is changing. So there would be my second slide in my presentation. Here would be my third slide. So again, the photo, now mine's getting a little bit lighter. Shutter speed here, aperture, and ISO. Okay, and there is my 4th photo. So shutter speed 1/30th of a second, aperture f6.3, and ISO 100. So that's all you need is a Google Slide or a Google Doc with your photo and then the accompanying settings. And there should be 4 photos and obviously then the settings that go with each of the 4 photos. All right, if you have any questions at all, let me know. And that's all you need to do for this part of this unit is you need to create a Google Slide presentation or a Google Doc containing your 4 photos with the accompanying settings that you used on your camera to take those photos. And then after that, we will work on our next step in this photography unit. All right, good luck.